Resuming debate, the honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There's a lot to say with respect to this issue. So I'm thankful for the opportunity to be able to put some thoughts on the record about what's going on here. And I think the important thing to acknowledge at the outset, because the substance of what we're talking about is a strike at Canada Post, a rotating strike, mind you, one that was designed not to completely interrupt the operation of Canada Post. So, and I have to say, by and large, people actually have been getting their mail, and I think the government, along with management, and we've heard the numbers from people on the ground in the plants who deliver the mail, are grossly exaggerating the extent of the backlog. So nevertheless, we're talking about people's right to strike. We're talking about the right to strike of Canadian workers. And I think it bears saying that nobody goes on strike lightly. Strikes aren't pleasant or fun for the people who go out on strike. They do it because they ultimately feel like they have no other recourse than to withhold their work, to get their employer to pay attention to the demands that they're making. In this case, some of the central demands are around the injury rate, around unplanned mandatory overtime. But you know, reasons vary from strike to strike, but the ultimate point is that it takes a lot to get workers to a place where they say the only thing left for us to do is to not perform the work, to put pressure on our employer, to hear our demands, and to come to some kind of reasonable deal at the negotiating table. So nobody should think that postal workers out there are happy to be on strike or that that's their first option. It comes at a financial price to the workers that are on strike, including in this case on a rotating strike. Nobody's getting paid for the days that they're not working, Mr. Speaker. So it's important to say that, and it's important to emphasize the importance of the right of collective bargaining. That's how workers have made gains over the past 100 or more years in order to get safe workplaces, in order to get better wages. And it's a right that is so important that I think it bears mentioning, Mr. Speaker, that right itself, it's contested today, it's been contested in the past. In the general strike of 1919 in Winnipeg, my home city, the central demand of that general strike was for the right to bargain collectively, because it was typical that governments would step in and help companies bust up unions to make illegal collective bargaining in a workplace, which incidentally is what this Liberal law will do in the Canada Post workplace. And that's why you saw tens of thousands of people go out into the streets, unionized and non-unionized workers. It wasn't because of a wage demand. It was because people saw the importance of collective bargaining in order to make a difference in their work life and their family life and the life of their community. And indeed, where workers have had that right to bargain collectively, we know that we've seen healthier communities. Workers on average are paid in the order of about $5 more an hour where they have a union as opposed to where they don't. We know that some of the great gains in workplace safety and health that have happened over the last 100 or 150 years have been because organized workers in their workplaces have pushed the envelope, and they've pushed the envelope politically by electing people out of the labor movement to come into places like these to push those gains and have them apply to all workers, not just workers who work in a unionized workplace. Collective bargaining has been what has made that possible. And it's important to emphasize again, because the government seems to have forgotten, that the Supreme Court has recognized that that form of bargaining, getting together in the workplace when something is wrong that's affecting everybody in the workplace, to go to your employer with a united voice and say something has to change. We like our work, we're proud of our work, we want to keep doing our work, but we want to be treated fairly, we want to be paid fairly, and we want to come home at the end of the day. That's a right that Canadians enjoy. The Supreme Court, in response to RCMP members who were fighting for that right, who were barred by federal legislation for 100 years from bargaining collectively, fought that battle in the Supreme Court and won in January of 2015, winning a victory for themselves and for workers across the country to have that confirmed. The Ontario Supreme Court confirmed that right in 2016 when they ruled on the Back to Work legislation of the Harper government and said that that was unconstitutional. And I dare say, Mr. Speaker, I expect that that will be confirmed again by the court, because we've got back-to-work legislation again that impinges on the right of Canadian workers to bargain collectively in their workplace to do better for themselves and their communities. And we've heard from the union representing postal workers that unfortunately they're going to have to take this government to court. What they want is a government that's willing to respect and defend the right to bargain collectively without a court order, Mr. Speaker, and I don't think that that's a lot to ask. So, as I say, we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of the 1919 general strike. That strike lasted 6 weeks. It cut across all industries. It cut across, already unionized members and non-unionized members, and the point was to safeguard this right. And we've made a lot of progress since then, but it is amazing to me, Mr. Speaker, that even now in the 21st century, even now after the court has said it's a charter right of Canadians to bargain collectively, after we've seen all the evidence of the good that collective bargaining has done for Canadian workers over the last 100 years, that we would be in this place of all places arguing against a government that is introducing legislation to deny that right to a category of Canadian workers. I think that's shameful. So I wanted to just back up a little bit, Mr. Speaker, and talk about the importance of collective bargaining in general and what it's done. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about another aspect of what we're discussing today, which is a motion that pertains to the back-to-work legislation that will significantly curtail debate on the legislation itself. And I think it bears noting, Mr. Speaker, that we're not yet even debating the legislation itself. And we only saw that legislation yesterday. And by the end of the day today, or in the wee hours of Saturday morning, that'll all be said and done. It'll be over. So we got notice, we got the actual wording of the legislation yesterday, and sometime just after midnight tonight, this whole thing is going to be said and done with. Now, I don't think that's what people expect when it comes to serious scrutiny of legislation. I think they expect there to be a role for Parliament in making these kinds of decisions. And the fact of the matter is, when that's all the time you get, you don't. And of course, who are the people that are most directly affected by this legislation? Well, it's postal workers. They weren't here on the Hill yesterday when the government tabled the legislation. They're out across the country, for the most part, still delivering the mail because it's only a rotating strike. Most of them are at work, Mr. Speaker. Any Canadian who's receiving a letter in their mailbox today will know that those postal workers are out working, as they have been since October 22nd, when the rotating strike began. There's only been a few days in any one particular area that's actually had a meaningful disruption where there's actually been a disruption of service, and otherwise the mail's been delivered on time. So, so the question is, why is it that they don't have a chance for what's in the legislation to filter down? The government's making some arguments here about, well, we're going to have a mediator, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Anything to distract from the fact that they're actually taking away those workers' constitutional right to bargain at the negotiating table, which is what they and their duly elected representatives, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, have said that they want to do. Anything to distract from that. But postal workers aren't going to have a chance to debate that or talk about that amongst themselves because they're out doing their job. And the legislation was only made public yesterday. So by the time this all wraps up and the postal worker that's been out delivering the mail Monday to Friday gets an opportunity to try and catch up on what's been happening here on Saturday, what they're going to read is that they've already been legislated to work on Monday. So it's not just that politicians in this place want more time to discuss the legislation. That's not the only thing that's wrong with this super closure motion that doesn't even allow for as many MPs as would like to get up and speak to the legislation. It puts a limit on the debate of just several hours, Mr. Speaker, ignoring the usual rules of this place, which means that only, maybe 10 or 12 MPs at half an hour each are going to be able to rise in this place and give a speech, Mr. Speaker. So it's not just that. It's also the time that it takes for information about what's happening here to filter down to the real people that it affects and then for them to be able to send feedback back here in terms of what they think. And the Liberals are taking away that opportunity from members of this place, but also members of civil society and the workers that are going to be directly affected by this back-to-work legislation. So I would say shame on the government for that. Now, I do want to come and address some of the particular issues of this strike, because we're now in a position where the government has decided to get involved. I would argue, Mr. Speaker, they should have gotten involved on the issues, not the bargaining process, but the issues a long time ago, because none of these issues are new. None of these issues are a surprise. And the fact of the matter is, one of the principal reasons that Canada Post workers are out on strike is because they have an obscenely high rate of injury in their workplace. And that, I mean, Canada Post has a long history. It's an institution that's been around for a long time. That injury rate hasn't been. In the last 10 years or so, there have been major changes in the way that Canada Post does its delivery and the system that they use and the equipment that they've asked postal workers to use. And that has correlated with a serious increase in the injury rate. And the way that they plan their routes has also correlated with an increase in the use of mandatory overtime and the injury rate, Mr. Speaker. So that's what postal workers are out there for. If you take the injury numbers and you project forward between now and Christmas, if things go just as they've been going at Canada Post, you're talking about at least 315 disabling injuries happening to postal workers between when this legislation passes and Christmas Day. That's an obscene level of injury, Mr. Speaker. And I have to say, I come out of the construction industry. That's where I worked before getting elected to this place as a construction electrician. If I showed up on a job site and I was told that in the last year, 25% of every construction worker that walked onto this site was injured, you better believe you'd have a hard time finding people willing to do that. And I think it's a testament to the dedication of postal workers. It's exactly because they take pride in their job, and exactly because they believe in the work they're doing and they understand the importance of people getting their mail, particularly vulnerable people and seniors who depend on getting that door-to-door delivery. Postal workers understand that better than anyone, and it's a testament to them and their dedication that they've been out there doing that work. So when you hear the minister impugning their motives and talking about, we need to do this on behalf of the vulnerable, and we need to do this on behalf of, people who need their check, when we know, because we've been sent the evidence of it to our offices in pictures and emails and everything else, that there was a missive gone out by Canada Post management ordering the withholding of those checks, of OAS checks or GIS or, social assistance checks at the provincial level. It's tough to hear. And I know that if I was a postal worker, frankly, Mr. Speaker, I can't use the word to describe how I would feel because it's not parliamentary. But I'd be angry if I heard that after receiving an order like that from management, that the minister was getting up in the House and blaming a rotating strike for the fact that those people aren't getting paid, when we know full well that it's because management chose to withhold those checks that people aren't getting paid. And I would point you to an example, Mr. Speaker, from 2011. When the postal workers weren't on strike, they were locked out.
Exactly.
They were locked out. That was the company who said, we want to put a kibosh on delivering the mail because it will put pressure on the government. Will give an excuse. I don't think they needed to put pressure on the Harper government to intervene. It will provide a fig leaf for the Harper government that's going to come in and legislate them back to work. The company locked them out, and postal workers showed up voluntarily to deliver people's checks because they knew the effect that that would have. And they should have expected some reciprocity from this government for this minister has the audacity to get up in this place and talk about how concerned she is about people not getting their checks. What about the Canada Post workers that the company cut off on October 22nd when the rotating strike began, who were on short-term disability, who haven't been paid since, Mr. Speaker? Or the mothers that were on maternity leave and budgeted based on a top-up in their collective agreement that the company summarily took away from them. What about those people? Where's the concern for them, Mr. Speaker? What about the people on long-term disability that were denied their payments because of the company? Where's the sympathy for them? Where's the action for them? So crocodile tears indeed, Mr. Speaker, from this minister who wants to get up and sing some big swan song about people not getting paid when we know that postal workers would be happy to make sure that those checks get delivered, and that this is a government that didn't even have the decency to make sure that the people who are on short-term disability because they work in a workplace with one of the highest injury rates going in the country weren't getting their checks from this government, Mr. Speaker. It's too much, frankly. It really is. You could get pretty worked up about it, Mr. Speaker, and I have on occasion. It's also pretty rich coming from a government who says that they want to stand up for women in the workplace and that they believe in pay equity, because one of the major issues of this strike, alongside the injury rate, is the fact that rural and suburban mail carriers, who are predominantly women, are not paid the same for doing the exact same work as their counterparts, more like, with a higher percentage of men in urban centers who are delivering that mail. That's one of their key demands. So we got a Minister of Labour who, on the one hand, is getting up, bragging about pay equity legislation that, if and when it's passed, will come into effect some 10 years from now. We're all supposed to go give her a pat on the back and be really proud of her for the great work she's doing, when they're screwing Canada Post workers with this back-to-work legislation and not letting them get meaningful action on pay equity. This is something they could do now, just by getting out of the way, at least. Better would be if they gave a meaningful mandate to the Canada Post management that they hired, that is doing all these things, and said, get to the bargaining table, get serious about pay equity, get serious about reducing the injury rate, actually listen to what the union is proposing, because we want a deal that brings that injury rate down. We want a deal that brings meaningful pay equity to postal workers, and we know that we can do that now. That's what they should be doing. But instead, from the beginning, by having inaction on that, because there hasn't been, they talk about how negotiations have been going on for a year, but they haven't gotten anywhere. That's because Canada Post management clearly does not have a mandate to make progress. Canada Post does not have a mandate to take the demands of the union when it comes to the workplace injury rate or pay equity seriously, or you would have seen some movement, and you haven't. There's a reason for that, Mr. Speaker. So, for them to now be getting up and saying, oh, well, now there's a crisis, we need to, and we have no choice but to do this. They've had a choice. They've had a choice since they formed a government to put a management team in Canada Post that was going to tackle these issues, make meaningful progress, so that by the time they got to the bargaining table, there was a better relationship because there was evidence of actually reducing the injury rate and making progress on pay equity. They decided not to do that, Mr. Speaker. That's how we got to here. And then, when the rotating strike began and Canada Post made the callous decision to punish its most sick and vulnerable workers, the government could have sent a signal that that wasn't okay, that it wasn't going to be that kind of bargaining, that if management at Canada Post thought that it was going to go on the attack and try and break the strike instead of taking meaningful action on those demands, that they were going to have to answer to the government. And instead, they stood silent. We stood up day after day after day asking them to do something about it, and they took a pass. And if you think that that didn't send a clear message to Canada Post that they were going to get off the hook acting like a bunch of Pinkertons and strike breakers, then you got another thing coming, Mr. Speaker. And then, when 2 weeks into the rotating strike, they signaled the readiness to bring in back-to-work legislation, they poisoned the well. And from that point on, at least when it was public, there was no chance that Canada Post was going to come and provide a negotiated deal at the table, because they knew the government was going to come in and save their skin. So for them to get up and tell us that they had no choice, or that they haven't been partisan in these negotiations, is just a total load of crap, Mr. Speaker. So wake up! Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Beaches East York.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for his comments. This is obviously a difficult conversation, and I agree with the Minister when she says that a negotiated outcome and decision would be a better one, quite obviously. The parties don't seem to be close, and there are obviously consequences for the Canadian economy more broadly, and so I don't sit as a member of the government more formally, but I can imagine sitting in the minister's shoes and looking more broadly to say my responsibility to the Canadian economy, Canadian society. I've heard there are impacts on small businesses, on international commerce, and how do I balance all these considerations? And the member was very insistent that this legislation would be unconstitutional, but we know in 2011, when the court made a decision in 2016 to rule that the 2011 legislation unconstitutional, it was because it wasn't minimally impairing, and it didn't allow the union to be have an equal footing in the mediation and arbitration process, which this legislation, in my view, would do in a more proper way. And so I wonder if the member could speak to minimal impairment and why he thinks that this legislation is unconstitutional.
The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, I said that the union is going to be taking this legislation to court, and I suspect they may well find that it doesn't respect people's right to bargain collectively, because they should be at the table. So when we hear from a government, I mean, if we heard it from the Conservatives, it'd be one thing. It's hearing it from a government that swears up and down that it believes in the collective bargaining process. And so when I talk about all the things the government has done in terms of failing to act on the injury rate and other things, this crisis doesn't just come because the workers, as a last resort, decided to go out on a rotating strike. These aren't new issues. They didn't come out of nowhere. So I think it's incumbent upon the government, instead of just trying to put this on Canada Post workers now that are using their tool of last resort to get action, I think the government needs to own up and say, we should have been doing something about this a long time ago, and recognize the fact that a number of the actions that the government took in this process over the last 4 or 5 weeks poisoned the well, that's not what good faith collective bargaining looks like, and it's certainly not what a government that supports collective bargaining looks like. And as long as governments that profess to be supporters of collective bargaining are going to be the ones to go away and undercut it and take it away effectively, then any legal point notwithstanding, we are not going to find ourselves in a position in Canada where workers are able to exercise their right meaningfully. Because companies are going to know that when they come asking, as long as they're big enough, as long as they're an eBay or a Netflix or a Facebook or an Air Canada, thinking about what you guys did to aircraft maintenance workers with Bill C-10, where no election commitment. In fact, it went contrary to what the government was saying before the election, and they allowed Air Canada offshore a bunch of maintenance work. As long as companies know that when they come knocking, if they're big enough, the government is going to see to it that they get their way, then workers aren't going to have meaningful rights in Canada, whatever the legal status is.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague in the NDP for his speech. Certainly I know his track record in raising concerns by union members and constituents in his ridings. I would ask him to address two things. I have been hearing from a lot of small and medium-sized businesses in my riding, recently owner of a Bobcat business, the Bowmanville Foundry, about problems with payments with the mail situation. So I'd like him to comment on, is he hearing those same concerns? And I think that's what Parliament needs to balance, these concerns. But also I'd like his comments on the parliamentary secretary today, and to comment on how that member, when he was in opposition, certainly took a different approach to back-to-work legislation, and how it must frustrate the NDP to see the Liberals on their side in opposition and not on their side in government. His thoughts on that, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to comment on a couple things. So I'll start with the last one maybe and just say, it has been a real disappointment, and I think you can see it in the ashen look of the parliamentary secretary when he gets up, that he doesn't even believe what he's saying. But he's part of a government that, whatever the principles of the people who may happen to belong to it are, he's part of a government that's first and foremost committed to Bay Street. So when they come knocking, when a big company comes knocking, in this case, the oddity of it is that it's Canada Post. I mean, it's a publicly run corporation. So the question is, well, why wouldn't the government do something about it? And then the answer is the letter from eBay, right? And so then, okay, well, a big multinational is upset about what's going on, so we got to jump to it. And you can see, I don't think the parliamentary secretary believes what he's saying. All's the more the shame, because on something this important, you should be getting a sincere answer. And if they can't provide a sincere answer, that's how you know they're doing the wrong thing. On the question of businesses that are being impacted by the rotating strike, I have a couple things to say. The first of all is to express some sympathy. There is some disruption. I mean, you don't have a strike without a disruption. Part of the point is to show the value of the work that postal workers do every day. And when they're not there to do it, it's a problem. But I'll tell you, when 25% of them are getting injured in a year, you're going to have a crisis eventually. And it's not going to be because you have a strike. It's going to be because you can't maintain the workforce out pounding the pavement and getting those letters and parcels delivered. So there's a crisis at Canada Post in terms of the injury rate, and something needs to be done about that. I have sympathy for business, and I have sympathy for Canadians. I'm among them. You know, Christmas is coming, and we do some online shopping too. It's inconvenient. It's a pain. I do get that. But I don't think that the appropriate thing to do is to put this all back on workers that have been working under terrible conditions for years. I think we need to be saying, why doesn't Canada Post take responsibility for the fact that there's been a work stoppage? Because there's a seriously high injury rate and there's other issues of fairness in their workplace. They should get it sorted out for the sake of business.
Questions and comments, the honourable member for Regina Luban.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We just had a government member stand up and ask the opposition to explain why this proposed back-to-work legislation might be unconstitutional. All we know for sure is that the last time the Government of Canada ordered postal workers back to work, it was ruled unconstitutional. A way that we might be able to figure out whether this proposed legislation is also unconstitutional is by having a full debate on it in this House and by having a rigorous study of it at committee. So if even Liberal MPs are asking whether or not this legislation is constitutional, that really seems to make the case against this motion to accelerate the back-to-work legislation and in favor of doing our due diligence as parliamentarians. Now, Mr. Speaker, something else the government has said that is a bit rich is we heard the Minister of Public Services and Procurement say that other countries have stopped delivering mail to Canada, as though this is some sort of international crisis. I think it's pretty important to put on record that the reason other countries aren't delivering mail to Canada is that Canada Post itself has asked them not to. So, Mr. Speaker, I think there is a problem with the government taking an action from Canada Post management and using it as a justification for applying back-to-work legislation against its employees. And I wonder if the member for Elmwood-Transcona can think of any other instances of the government using that tactic in this debate. Thank you.
The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, thank you very much to the member for Regina Luban for his question. And of course, this is one of the great frustrations of this whole situation, is that we've had Canada Post claim that there's a huge backlog. We've got reports from the people that actually work in the facilities where the trucks are say that those numbers are hugely overinflated. We've got Canada Post, as the member rightly pointed out, telling mail services outside of Canada not to send mail into Canada and then saying, oh my God, nobody's sending mail to Canada, this is terrible, we need to have back-to-work legislation. We've got a minister herself, who herself earlier got up and talked about people's assistance checks not being delivered and failed to mention the fact that actually Canada Post management told their employees that they weren't allowed to deliver that mail. And so this has been part of the problem all along, and it's consistent with the pattern of signaling that we've seen from the government when they decided to ignore the attack on sick and vulnerable workers, when they signaled only a couple weeks into the strike that they were contemplating back-to-work legislation, and then they've been complicit in all of these, and in fact now starting to repeat these trumped-up claims of crisis by management. These are textbook strike-breaking techniques. It's not a mystery what they're doing or where the ideas come from. This is the way that these things are done. And to see a government that says that it's pro-labor and that it wants to defend the middle class and it wants to have a good relationship with Canada's unions, using the textbook techniques of strike breaking right here in this place and with their legislation is just too much to take, frankly. It makes me really angry, and I hope that Canadians that are out there who are working people and want fairness in their workplace and fair wages are paying attention and can see through this sham.
Resuming debate.